Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Pat Serkey, Director of the Forum, and my role here tonight is just to introduce Gary Orfield, Professor of Education and Co-Director of the Civil Rights Project at Harvard University. Dr. Orfield's most recent research study, released on Martin Luther King Jr. Day 2003, examines a multiracial society with segregated schools. He will introduce our speaker, Margaret McKenna, and lead our discussion on educating educators. Thank you.
Good evening. American educators, policymakers, and parents often seem overwhelmed by the controversy about current public education systems. And our public schools are seen to be unable to meet all the demands society places on them. Public education in the United States is the subject of a massive national debate. How can we better prepare children for life as citizens, workers, and responsible adults in the 21st century? What's the role of our schools and our teachers? The second of 4 programs on schools and society focuses on the pivotal role of teachers, the way in which they are trained, the tools they need to succeed, and the challenges our public schools have in store for them. Here to discuss these questions is Margaret McKenna, president since 1985 of Lesley University, our neighbor here at Harvard Square, the largest provider of graduate education to classroom teachers in the United States. The new federal education law, the No Child Left Behind Act, requires that all the schools serving poor children have highly qualified teachers. But many critics conclude that it has no mechanisms to make that happen for training those teachers or holding them in those schools. This is the basic work of many people at Lesley University. Previously, Dr. McKenna served as director of the Bunting Institute, vice president of Radcliffe College, and in her youth as a civil rights lawyer at the Department of Justice, much later as the White House Deputy Counsel to President Jimmy Carter, and as Deputy Undersecretary for the U.S. Department of Education. Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Margaret McKenna.
Good evening, and it's a pleasure to join you here this evening. In these troubled times, if we are to look for answers in the future, the place to look is our schools. Because if we have any hope for the future, the hope is in education. George Bernard Shaw once said, "To me, the soul of hope of human salvation lies in teaching." And I'm a firm believer in that statement. We've heard a lot in the press and read a lot, I'm sure you have, about the challenge ahead in the next 5 to 7 years about finding teachers to replace the teachers in the schools. There is a strong wave of teachers retiring over the next few years. And where are the teachers going to come to replace them? So we're talking approximately 2.5 million teachers that we will need to hire over the next 5 to 7 years. Where are they going to come from? And what is that going to mean? I see this as probably one of the greatest opportunities this country has had in many, many decades. Because when you think what it would be to put 2.5 million well-qualified, well-motivated teachers in our classrooms, we could change teaching and learning in this country. If we, in fact, support that and support bringing in highly qualified teachers. So I don't see this as a problem. I see it as a challenge, but I see it as an enormous opportunity to be part of a solution for our schools. The impact would be not just this generation, but it would be many generations, because an educated populace has children and encourages them in education. So the ripple and impact effect of good teaching and changing teaching and learning is enormous and goes on and affects us in such positive ways. I can't think of anything that would be more important than to look at this opportunity ahead of us. So let's talk a little bit tonight about what makes a good teacher and whether or not that's important. First, I want to say that the number one factor in the success of students in a classroom is a good teacher. And there is no number 2, 3, 4, or 5. After number 1, you go to 10. It's not resources, it's not class size, it's not neighborhood, it's not facilities, it's not politics, it is the quality of the teacher. Teaching is, in some cases, the most isolating profession there is. You go in the classroom, you close the door, and you are it. Those students are dependent on you for their learning. And whether or not, if you have a class of 30 or you have a class of 5 and you have a mediocre teacher, you have mediocre learning. So what California did in terms of class size, in lowering the class size, now it's up to 3rd grade, but they had no plan about what to do about the increase of classes. So what they ended up with is a lot of small classes with a lot of unqualified teachers in those small classes. That does not help student learning. And it is unfortunately a typical case of public policy in this country and what we call education reform. People say the answer to the school problem is smaller classes, so let's have smaller classes. So we pass a referendum, we have smaller classes. Nobody asks the next question, which is, where are the teachers going to come for these small classes? No one asks that question. 1/3 of the new teachers hired in the Los Angeles school system have no training in education whatsoever, have no certification to teach whatsoever. One of my stories, I would say favorite stories, but least favorite stories really, is talking to a Lesley College grad who was teaching in the Los Angeles school system. This was several years ago. She was a 1st grade teacher, I would say a highly qualified 1st grade teacher. There were 6 1st grades on her floor. She was the only one with any experience or training. She spent all her time trying to support these poor people who were in classrooms with no experience and no know-how, highly motivated, but really did not know what to do with a 1st grade class. So if in fact we're talking about achievement and accountability, which is what we talk about a lot today, is if we want our students and student success, we can tie student success to good teaching. And one of the reasons that people become good teachers is that they stay in the classroom and they become highly skilled in their craft. So the first 3 years are still a learning experience for teachers, no matter how well trained and educated they've been. But the problem is we have 40-50% of the teachers leaving in the first 3 years. What we have found out is, why do teachers leave? The number one reason that teachers in this country leave is because they feel not supported and not prepared. It is not economics. Now, economics is a factor, but it is not the number one reason people leave teaching. They leave because they don't feel supported in their environment. They walk into their classroom, they're alone, and they don't feel prepared, not just to teach, but to deal with the culture of the schools and to deal with parents and with communities. They don't feel prepared. What we do know is that highly qualified teachers stay longer, and that we can measure the success of students in terms of the quality of the teacher. This has been done in a number of studies, a major study in the Kentucky schools, but also Linda Darling-Hammond's recent study demonstrated that highly qualified teachers and student achievement, there is a ratio between highly qualified teachers and student achievement, student success. And let's talk a little bit about what is a highly qualified teacher. In Linda Darling-Hammond's study, she looked at teachers who were in 5-year programs, 4-year undergraduate programs, master's degree in education, 4-year programs where they were certified, and teachers from alternative education programs. Teach for America, the MINT program in Massachusetts, the Alternative Accelerated program in New York. And she compared the accelerated programs to the 4-year programs and the 5-year programs. She found 2 things. One, the teachers stayed longer. They retained in the classroom. And second, there was a significant increase in the achievement of the students who were in classrooms with highly trained teachers, defined as teachers who came through programs. Now, let me suggest that I do not think the answer is to educate everyone through a school of education or an education program. I think there are some extremely poor education programs in this country, and they should be closed down. If we really value teaching and we really think it's important to be well educated, then we have to ensure that the institutions that are educating them are doing a good job. And if they're not, they should not be in this business. It's too important. That takes a lot of courage, but we need to have it. I do believe that alternative routes have not shown their effectiveness. Now, this is not, I think there are individuals who can come to an accelerated program, and they're unusual, highly motivated, and they just instinctively know how to teach. And they are successful. They are in the far minority of people. The people have gone through Teach for America. I mean, I have a friend whose daughter is in Teach for America. She graduated from Columbia. She, highly motivated young woman. She was sent to rural Mississippi to teach. She called her parents every night and cried. Every single night. She cried for two reasons. One is she was totally in a place where she had no understanding of the culture, no understanding what people were saying to her. And they didn't understand her, either culturally or even literally understand what she was saying with her accent. And second, she had entered this motivated out of all the good reasons that people go into teaching. She wanted to be there. She wanted to be part of the solution. She wanted to help kids. She knew she wasn't doing that. She wasn't prepared to do that. So she felt bad for herself. She felt bad for her inability to do what she had wanted to do. So what does it take to be a highly qualified teacher? I think it takes content. It takes pedagogy, understanding pedagogy, understanding how to teach. Just because you've got a lot of things in your head doesn't mean that you can have anyone else understand what's in your head. So brilliance alone is definitely not the answer. But understanding how other people learn. When I talk about teaching, I always say teaching and learning. Because you can be a great teacher, and if nobody learns anything, you're not really a great teacher. But you can be a brilliant lecturer. But 6 months later, when your students, whether adults or children, are tested on what you brilliantly lectured on, and they don't remember any of it, then you're not a very good teacher. And one of the things we've learned is what I'm doing tonight is not very good teaching. But what we'll do later is. If you have to engage people, involve people, and then they will assimilate it, remember, and it will become part of them. But lecturing is not the answer. And people need to truly understand teaching and learning, child development, and differentiated learning styles. People learn in all different ways, and the burden is on the teacher to find out how you learn, not on the student. The student has to be part of the contract, but the teacher has to understand that people learn in very different ways, and he or she needs to have a whole range of methods to teach a certain subject. I also think that when we talk about highly educated or highly qualified teachers, people often say they have to have, these three things. But the reality is that teachers at different levels need very different things. If you are going to teach AP physics in high school, you need to have a very different background than somebody teaching first grade. But when you hear public policymakers talk about teaching, they hardly ever differentiate. I think that some of the accelerated programs, if they were in fact enhanced, might work for some of the high-needs areas in high school in science and math. If people have the content area, I think there are ways that we could enhance the programs. I think trying to take someone and make them a first-grade teacher without extensive understanding of child development and learning styles is a very, very difficult proposition. So I think that we always need to differentiate between what level we're talking about. And just like anything else, we need to fit the education and experiences to, in fact, the student that they will teach. Right now in Massachusetts, we have what we call alternative certification. And basically, if you go through an education program and are certified, just like you would be at Lesley if you graduated either in the undergraduate school or our many graduate school programs, we are dictated exactly what that student should take in terms of courses and content, but literally courses. If, in fact, you go through an alternative program, you can graduate with any degree in anything, and you can do 50 hours of training with a school system. That's the requirement. All of the people I've talked about, whether they're in ed school or not, have to take the teacher test. But that's the disparity of requirements. And while I think there ought to be high standards, there's a lot of dictating what you take if you're a student in an education program. There's very little standard if you don't go through an education program, except that you pass the teacher test and do 50 hours of training. I do think that the programs like the Massachusetts MINT program, which not only I think have deficiencies in terms of training and deficiencies in terms of the people who go through this program and their ability to teach, they also have a very high attrition rate. It's 2 or 3 times the attrition rate, the normal attrition rate of people who come through education programs. So, but I do think there might be ways to enhance these programs, and one of those ways, if you do these summer programs, which a lot of them are for 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, I think that you have to have some experience in a classroom with a master teacher before you have your own classroom. So in fact, if we could have this program where you were in the program in the summer, and for a fall semester you were an assistant teacher, I would feel much better about these programs. But we're sending people in the classroom who have no idea what they're getting into, and they're going to learn on these students. In the New York program, which was on the front of the New York Times 2 years ago, they had 300 or 400 students. 24 of them quit the first day in a classroom, the first day. And these were, lawyers and accountants and people from advertising who were well motivated, but literally left the first day. And there's something wrong with that system, both in terms of how we're serving our students, but also what we're saying to people about teaching. So what do we do? I think the first thing we do is recruit and encourage people to go into teaching. I'm a product. My parents were both public school teachers their whole lives. I have an aunt who taught 50 years, 50 years in the public school system in Rhode Island, in junior high school of all places. I mean, talk about a challenge. I had a father who taught for 40 years, a mother who taught for 33 years. So I grew up in a family of educators. And my dad at the time was the head of the library board. He was a Democratic state committee man. He was the head of the charter commission, because teachers were, in fact, the people you turn to in terms of public policy, in terms of input for their influence and their knowledge. So, if we really want good teachers, we have to learn a way to respect the profession again and honor it. One of the things that so troubles me in being in a university and in hearing other universities and faculty members is faculty members who actively discourage young people from going into teaching. Somebody says, well, I'm thinking about teaching. And they say, well, why? You're so smart. You could be a biologist, or, you could be a psychologist, or you could be a sociologist. Why would why don't you think of graduate school and go get, So we, all of us, need to find ways to encourage people who are highly motivated and interested to go into teaching. I often, when I'm sitting in a dinner or a fundraising event where there are a lot of people of wealth, and they're complaining to me about the school systems and the public school system, and I talk to them about it, and I always ask at the end of the meeting, I always say, how many of you would be happy if your child or grandchild became a teacher? And there's such silence. I also ask people, when you're at a cocktail party, exciting people all around, and you walk up to somebody and you say, how are you? I'm Margaret McKenna. And they say, what do you do? And the person says, I'm a teacher. What do you do? People walk away. They think it's not interesting. What are we saying about this profession that supposedly we're depending on, our hope for the future? We're depending on teachers. And I remember John Gardner always said, society gets what it values. And if we really valued teaching, we would talk about it and we would reward it in different ways. So recruit people, good people, into teaching, encourage them, encourage these highly motivated, not only young people, but other people who want to change their professions to go into teaching, and reward them. Pay scales and conditions of work need to be improved. I think we also need to rationalize the process by which we certify teachers. Make it, what is the goal here? I think there ought to be a national teacher test. Now, that sounds like it flies in the face of everything else I said, but I would rather have a national teacher test that was validated and that we could then have teachers move around the country much more easily rather than an individual teacher test. And I would suggest the teacher test that's in the 45 other states rather than the one that's in Massachusetts. Because I think the one in Massachusetts does not serve our students or our teachers well. And so I think they're having a national teacher test, but the national teacher test is a floor. It's the minimum standard. You have to pass it. It doesn't mean you can be a good teacher. All it means is you have basic knowledge to become a teacher. That does not mean you can be a teacher. There has to be much more in terms of a profile of what a teacher can do. I think we have to develop new models. People keep talking about the medical model. Well, a lot of us have had a medical model of teaching for 30 years. We've had a model with Buckingham, Brown and Nichols and Shady Hill. The Devers School in Boston, we now have the same model. Brookline School, we have the same model, where people spend the summer at Lesley. They spend the semester on the campus of the school as apprentice teachers in 2 classrooms, taking courses at the site. Our Devers students in the public school in Boston don't come to the campus. They are actually take their courses right at the Devers School. We've had this program. Lots of other people need to think about apprentice programs, and we need to think about new models. We also need to support our teachers with professional development. I say again, teaching is an isolated experience, and we need to support people with professional development, talk to their colleagues, learn new ways. My experience at Lesley, one of the first experiences I had was going to Mary Mindus's kindergarten conference. Mary Mindus has taught at Lesley for 40 years. And by the way, she was the first person who used technology in her classroom. And she had created the kindergarten conference. And the first time I ever went there were 3,000 kindergarten teachers, or, really pre-K through 3. And I thought we were giving away money. Because people could not wait to get into a lecture, could not wait to get into a demonstration, so they could pick that up, that knowledge, and take it home. And if people have any question about the motivation of teachers, they ought to go to one of these conferences where people see it's like they're picking up gold, and that gold is going to be turned into learning for their students. They would see how highly motivated so many teachers are and how good at what they do. So I also think that I want to also remember that, like the medical model, the medical oath of do no harm should be first. And I think putting unqualified teachers in the classroom, even if they are brilliant, makes me extremely nervous. Because the first thing I want to protect is a child's self-esteem. And the first thing I want to protect is a sense of community and tolerance in a school. I think if people would remember Columbine, and what went on in that school in terms of bullying, what went on in that school in terms of every TV in the school, in every hallway, had the football game rerun and rerun, emphasizing sports, emphasizing winning. If, in fact, we looked at the culture of some schools and saw what you need to be a teacher is not just brilliance, but what you need to be a teacher is to understand children and to understand tolerance and understand really when the federal government says leave no child behind, we mean all those children. We mean high expectations for everyone. We mean that children mean all children, and that's our job, is to find a way to each of those minds and encourage all those children, not just to learn, but to be individual and contributing citizens. I would take that above everything else. I would take a school where children learn how to read and feel safe and feel good as human beings. And then I think everything else is easy. I think if by 2nd or 3rd grade everybody can read, they feel safe, they feel good about themselves, I think the schools would be a better place and the world would be a better place. So let me just end by saying, that I'm an optimist. I think that the schools are the answer, and I think we have a chance in the next years to bring an influx of wonderful people to the schools and to support the people who are in the schools now to do all the things that we need them to do. And there's no question in my mind that the Kofi Annans and the Martin Luther Kings and the Jeffersons and the university presidents and the civil rights leaders are in our schools now. And what they're waiting is for that teacher to open the door to the future for them, the right door, find the right door for them. And I cannot think of anything more important than this society in encouraging people of all ages, from all backgrounds, to spend some of their lives in teaching devoted to that mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're now joining us at the Cambridge Forum, listening to President Margaret McKenna of Lesley University discussing educating educators. And I get the first question. What I'd like to ask you is, we have been seeing recent research that shows that as our schools resegregate, the white teachers are leaving those minority schools in large numbers. We've seen that recently in several places in the South, for example. What is Lesley University doing, and what do you think needs to be done to train teachers to work in a school system or in the country now that has 40% minority students and is training very few minority teachers?
Well, I would say two things. One is we need to find ways to recruit students of color into the profession, and a lot of us are trying to do that, and that is certainly one answer. I think, secondly, to educate a future teacher in an environment which is basically a white suburban environment is negligence. I think that schools of education or schools that are educating teachers have to have a presence of people of color on their faculty and on their administration. We also need to have curriculum which in fact reflects the true differences culturally, so that people, and I think that's true not for teachers, I think that's true for everybody. I think to send out students today in this world, Lesley graduates, 90% of them go into public service, education and human services. So, my stand at Lesley has been, our mission requires us to have diversity. Whether or not you think it's altruistic or right or wrong, I have no question that the mission requires us to have a diverse faculty and student body and administration, and that our curriculum needs to, in fact, reflect the variety of cultures and learning styles that exist to make our graduates successful. So I think both we need to recruit more students of color, and I think that our campuses have a significant burden to, in fact, be much more diverse than they are today in terms of being confident that we're giving the kind of experiences our future teachers need to have.
You're joining us at the Cambridge Forum listening to Margaret McKenna discussing educating educators, and the floor is now open for your questions.
Thank you for your talk tonight. I want to ask a question that I think relates to what you were just saying, and I'm wondering if you could reflect on what you think the impact of the Massachusetts teacher test is, both on the profession of teaching and on the education that our students in K-12 are receiving and will receive, in light of the history of the disparate impact that we know these kinds of teacher tests have along racial ethnic lines?
Well, as you can tell, I'm not a big supporter of the Massachusetts teacher test. I think it was poorly conceived. I think it was hurriedly instituted. I don't think it was well tested. I don't think it was well validated. I think there's no predictive reliability, and other than that, I think it's great. I think on the profession, I think it has had a chilling effect on some students, particularly students of color. We cannot get information by race from the teacher test. We got it from the first teacher test, where there was a 40% difference between African Americans and white students taking the test. Since that time, we have requested the information. We have not been able to receive it. My assumption is that hasn't changed much. But students know that. So I think, one, it's had a chilling effect on recruiting students of color into the profession. And also, it's given as an entrance exam for most colleges and universities. If you want to go into education, you have to pass the test before we'll take you, because everybody wants 100% passing rate, because that's what's published. So in fact, I think what we're doing is, I think there are some students who we could take who maybe couldn't pass the test. Isn't that what education's about? Couldn't pass the test as an entrance, but maybe we're close enough with some education and support, they might be able to pass the test. And schools are not doing that anymore. They won't let you in. So I think that's a chilling effect on the profession. And I think that that impact of having fewer students of color in the profession, and I also think on the impact of the test itself, has had a really negative effect on teachers and on people coming in. In spite of that, I still say I would support a national teacher test that was validated and rational and portable. But I think the Massachusetts test, in spite of the fact that now everybody's passing, 90%, 100% of everybody's passing, I don't think it meets its purpose. And there is not only in terms of people of color, linguistic minorities, because Massachusetts is the only state that has a dictation piece. We always like to be different, either ahead of the game or behind it. I'm not sure. This way I think is behind. But you just think about if English was not your first language, or you're not an auditory learner. See, this is what educators should know. Educators should know that some people are not auditory learners, no matter how smart they are or how good a teacher they would be. But we require people to sit, and we have a tape, and they take dictation. I think that is a very, very difficult thing for a lot of people to do, no matter how smart they are or what good teacher they would be. So I think it's a problem. I'd love to see it change to the praxis test, which is given in other states.
First of all, I want to say that your speech was inspiration, and it was also refreshing to hear somebody in education that talks like you. Because I think what we've heard here for a long time is what I consider things that don't really inspire kids mainly. Now, what I would like to ask you is, because I didn't understand exactly that part, what the gentleman asked, and that is always my question. I have lived before in Connecticut, and now I lived in Massachusetts. Both times I was in a suburb, and I have met many teachers. I also come from a family of teachers. And these teachers, white teachers, let's put it that way, do not seem to understand at all that the population of the school system nowadays, the lady before you last time said 50% minorities in Boston, you said 40%. I don't know, the gentleman referred to the South. Now, what are you going to do about these teachers that when I talk to them, they answer totally irrelevantly? The subject is, how do we inspire these kids? Because the elite is going to be inspired because, first of all, their parents are going to make sure they are exposed, and then they're going to send them, if the public school system fails, to these private schools. But how do we reach the average, even white kid, that's not privileged? And more than that, I don't like to talk about Afro-Americans. I like to talk about all minorities.
Well, I think that it is a big issue. I think that white teachers teaching kids at risk, students of all colors, and particularly kids from not only all colors, but rural areas are a problem, exactly. and also kids from low socioeconomic backgrounds. What do I think is the answer? I think the answer is how we train teachers. Leslie instituted 10 years ago a requirement that our undergraduates have to do one of their field placements in an urban, low socioeconomic, diverse school. So you cannot graduate from Leslie without having a teaching assignment, field placement, in a multicultural urban environment. So when we graduate our teachers, and I think everybody, we have a program at Shady Hill, which is not low income or urban in particular, a great school. But we have an apprentice program with them, and they get a Leslie degree. And we now require those students to leave Shady Hill and do the same thing, have a field placement in a multicultural urban setting, under the supervision of a master teacher. Now, is that the answer? No. But it's at least one answer in terms of recognizing that you cannot educate a teacher in a white environment, have them in a suburban school district student teaching, and expect them to go teach in an urban environment. It just doesn't work. You have to expose people, and you've got to give them a chance to be educated and to learn. And I think a lot of schools just don't do that. They don't feel it's their responsibility. I think a lot of schools do that.
But with all your experience, and it seems to be a lot, would it be crazy to think that maybe we should get rid of all these white teachers, and maybe if we don't have them, we could start fresh and find the inspired teachers that can really inspire our kids?
Well, I don't think it has anything to do with color or race. I think highly motivated teachers, there are some incredibly wonderful white teachers teaching in...
No, I'm not talking white color. I'm talking white mentality.
Yeah, well, I think that would be true of any mentality. It shouldn't be segregated unto your own. So obviously the answer would be people who are open to all sorts of learning styles, cultures, and ideologies make the best teachers.
Thank you very much. Next question.
You talked a little bit about the things that Leslie and other schools of education are doing to prepare teachers. You said one of the main reasons teachers leave the profession is they don't feel prepared. But clearly the influence of a school of education stops at graduation. Are there things that you see the society needs to do or the schools need to do that would better support teachers and would help them stay in the profession?
Absolutely. I think that the term is now called induction, which is the first year or two of teaching. And I think that no matter what kind of experience and training you've had, you need support in that first year. And whether or not that's informal cohort groups, I think schools ought to support their first-year teachers. We have seminars for our first-year teachers to come back with a cohort group and to receive support. And I think that sort of thing is very necessary, and either to do it physically, even to do it online, an online group to exchange ideas of first-year teachers with a master teacher would be one way to do it. But I think to leave people isolated and alone is a very difficult thing to do. I also say one other thing about preparation. I think besides I was sort of general about what people needed, but I also think that all teachers need special education training. I think the best classroom teachers have had a lot of special education training, because if you understand all sorts of learning styles, you will be a better teacher generally, and we require a lot of training for our teachers. And we talked about multiculturalism, but also understanding school policy and school culture is so important. And leadership, how to create social change in schools. If you go in and you see something wrong, how do you make it better? You don't just go in and say, you people just don't know how to do this, I'm going to tell you how to do it. That doesn't work.
Let me just turn the question back at you a little bit, because she was really asking more than that, like what kind of support from outside the schools do people need to give to teachers, not just in training, but how does our society treat teachers compared to other societies where it's a more honored profession?
Well, I think the answer's in your question, Gary. I mean, is we don't not honor our teachers, and I think the way we treat people, the way we reward them, the way we support them, how we talk about them. I called it for years the blaming brigades in the newspapers. Everything that was a problem in the school was because the teachers weren't any good, and I wish that there would be more in the media and more stories and more educators talk about the incredible motivation and expertise of the majority of the teachers in our schools, and the success stories are just incredible. And if we could concentrate more on some of the good things, I think it would encourage people more. And parents to be supportive. Parents and community leaders to be supportive and to find ways to encourage and reward teachers, include teachers. When you think about a community forum or a speaker or a task force where you want influential people, to include teachers. I mean, I think there are lots of ways to do it.
When if you read the congressional debate on the new federal education law, there's lots of conservatives that are basically sneering at teacher training institutions and teachers and teacher organizations. Why do you think that's taken hold in our politics so strongly?
I think that there are two reasons. I think that people do not appreciate what it takes to be a teacher. They think if there's a kid who's a smart kid, they can go in and teach. I think they don't understand what it takes. And there's been failures in the schools, so you got to find someone to blame. So let's blame the ed schools. And I think that the ed schools have some of the responsibilities here. I have no question about that. And I think that we have not been very good, schools who produce teachers, standing up and saying, here are the things we need to do. All schools need to do, not just I'm talking about. Everybody needs to do this. And if they're not doing it, they shouldn't be producing teachers. So I think some of the criticism about ed schools, in this day and age, what's going on in America, but Reed Lyon, who is the guru of the literacy programs, literally said on national television, bomb all the ed schools. And I saw him weeks later after he said that. He said, well, I was just trying to cause a controversy, but, that's the kind of thing that public policy people should be more responsible about. I mean, I think people should say ed schools need to be held to a standard. Let's look at student achievement of their graduates. I've said to everybody in Massachusetts, let's take all the superintendents and all the human services directors in every school system in Massachusetts and ask them what graduates they would hire from what schools. I have no fear about that whatsoever. I'm first on the list. Let's do that. Who would you hire? And name the schools. Name the top 3 schools. I know Leslie would be one of them, but none of my colleagues are not particularly enamored of that idea. But I think let's hold us feet to the fire. Do our people really? Are they going to the schools? They stay there and they're good. Let's find out.
Next question.
Good evening. First of all, thank you, President McKenna, for speaking tonight. My name is Nicole Corcoran, and I am a senior undergraduate of Lesley University right now, so I can certainly attest to everything that you spoke about tonight of Lesley really offering a higher education, and it's not just a plug for Lesley. I've had the benefit of wonderful instruction in my classes of content, of everything you spoke about with special education. And my question is, being that I'm graduating in May, I will be in the field next year, and something that you spoke about at the beginning of the program was in California, for instance, how they lowered their class size. And for me right now to be faced with the prospect of teaching next year, I'm still a little bit worried, and I feel that larger classes are still daunting. I feel confident in the education that I have, and I feel that I am or will be a very highly qualified teacher, but I still am a little bit nervous about higher class size, and I think that it is something that definitely needs to be on the platform of ed reform. So I was wondering how you feel about that, if those two things can really find space together in education reform right now. Is there room for both of them? If the present debates are all focused on qualifying educators, can we still focus on lowering class size? Because I think that it is important.
Thank you. That's a good point, and I didn't mean to say that I did not support smaller class sizes. But without combining it with qualified teachers, I don't think it makes a big difference. I do think that, a highly qualified teacher in a small class is more effective than a highly qualified teacher in a class of 35. So I definitely support the smaller class size. I just want to ensure that when we create that policy, that we've looked at the pipeline for who's going to teach in those classes. But I definitely agree.
You referred to good teachers, and I am just wondering, at one point you said something about there was a correlation between, in Linda Darling-Hammond's study, between the more training and then down the road the kids did better, students did better in assessment. So are you satisfied that, would you be satisfied with the definition of a good teacher as a teacher whose students perform well on a high stakes test? How do you measure a good teacher,
right,
essentially?
Well, for one thing, when I talk about performance or achievement, I'm not talking about achievement across the board. I'm talking about achievement gains. And that's very important, because if you are in, PS 92 in New York, in one of the poorest sections of the city, and you're at Shady Hill, and you both take an achievement test, that's not going to reflect on the qualities of the teacher. But if you take the test and then 6 months later you see that the students have moved up the scale, whether or not the Shady Hill students are at the 90th percentile and have moved to the 92nd, and the kids at PS 192 have moved from the 30th percentile to the 35th percentile, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking the ability for the teacher to move the student up the scale. I certainly think any comparison across schools, socioeconomic class, doesn't work. I mean, that doesn't show your worth as a teacher. And what you have is what we have now, which is you have the best teachers going to the schools with the highest achievement. That's what you have now. The first-year teachers are all put in the schools with at-risk kids. We should have our best teachers in the schools that need the best teachers. Some of these kids from affluent families, they come to school reading, writing, doing math. I mean, the teacher's there to facilitate their learning. I mean, it's pretty easy. I mean, in comparison. And so I do think that the ability to move children up the scale can be used as a reflection of a highly qualified teacher. But not as an objective measure comparing school to school.
Next question.
I have a question in response to what you just said about how the best teachers should actually be going to the schools with the most at-risk students. I have been in the field of education myself for a great many years at this point, and I am really scared about what's happening in education. And on the one hand, I'm scared in the sense that Vivian Trone and Kitty Bowles seem to be scared about what's happening to the quality of teachers. They see in their new book that they claim that teachers are not as good as they used to be, that a fairly high percentage of all teachers score on the lowest quartile of college entrance exams, and they say what has happened. The women's movement has created other opportunities for women, so the same kind of highly qualified women aren't going into teaching and probably aren't going into other professions also experiencing workforce crises like nursing, for example. But at the same time, we have standardized tests, the No Child Left Behind Act. Those highly qualified teachers that you'd like to lure into low-performing schools would be harshly judged by the standards of the No Child Left Behind Act. The last piece of this puzzle that really worries me is what's happening to our capacities at the federal, state, and local level to deal with the budgetary needs of our public sector. The Bush administration has been accused of not funding the No Child Left Behind Act as it needs to be funded. Under these circumstances, what to do right now?
It's a lot of questions.
That gets you a master's degree.
That's right, that does. Let me sort of start at the end maybe and work my way back. The No Child Left Behind, which I sort of I call a no testing expert left behind act, is authorized but not appropriated. I mean, people don't realize that. You realize that, but there are a lot of requirements in it that we're going to be appropriated, the funds we're going to be appropriated for and have not. So that is a problem, and will become more of a problem with the economy, and particularly in Massachusetts with what's going to happen with the schools and with the cuts that we're going to see not only this year but in 2004, I think are going to be very dramatic in what's going to happen with all of that. So I think I have a lot of nervousness about the cuts in terms of the economy, in terms of the federal requirements and mandates, in terms of what's going to happen in Massachusetts. I think what's going to happen to the schools could be devastating, and I don't have an answer for that. But I empathize and worry with you. I do think this issue about the teachers are not as good as they used to be. I hear the same thing about students. I remember a conversation with the former superintendent of schools in Boston, this was many years ago, and the conversation with him, he said, the students are not as good as they used to be. I thought, do you think the parents are keeping the good ones at home? You know, I was like, not as good as they used to. What does that mean? You know, because Boston is more diverse now. I mean, if that's the attitude we have about students, you know, the students are as good, they can't, therefore, that interpretation really is they're not as good, they can't learn. You know, I mean, that's what it really says. Some of these students I can't teach. I think the issue around the teacher is complicated. I think it's absolutely true that women who used to go into teaching are now going to be lawyers and doctors and getting their MBAs. And those professions were close to women. So I think it did have a significant impact on women, gender in the profession. At the same time, teaching has always been a first-generation college profession. The majority of people have always gone into teaching have always been first-generation college students. So people should remember that. And while we've had generations of teachers, you know, actually the majority of people, do you know that 40% of the people who went to teaching started in community colleges today? I saw that statistic. I couldn't believe it. And that's got a lot to do with California, where community colleges are very different than they are in Massachusetts. But a significant number of people who go into community college then go on to the profession. So I think we have to put it realistic. And I think we also have to think about, again, what are we talking about? We're talking about pre-K through AP courses, AP calculus. Okay? So what do we need for a first grade teacher? Do we need someone who has 1,600 on their SAT? I don't think so. And I also think that, we need someone who is, I think, the thing about education that excites me most is taking an average student and making them into a star. I'm not excited about, as much as I admire the folks across the street from Leslie at Harvard, those kids are stars. And, they're going to be stars. And yes, you can have wonderful intellectual experience, but you take a kid who is an average student and you open the world to them and you give them that sense of self-esteem and you show them what it's like to open up someone else's mind. I mean, that's an amazing thing to be able to do. So in some ways, we have students at all levels. It's one of the interesting things about Leslie. We have students with, 1,500 scores. And, we have the range of people, which is quite a challenge to have in our classes. But I think the most exciting thing is to take the average students who are highly motivated and turn them into great teachers. And I also think that only a piece of teaching is to be able to do AP calculus. A major piece of teaching is to understand pedagogy, understand learning styles, and have the kind of right motivation. So I don't think it's like, I don't know I'm sure what the best and the brightest are when people talk about that for teaching. I want a highly qualified teachers. I'll judge it by achievement. That's what I'll use as a judge. If students can achieve under this teacher, I'll be happy with it. And I also think, we will encourage more people, and I think we need to think about different ways of attracting people to teaching, so even if it's not full-time teaching. So we have math and scientists who will come in, who will help train, and who will teach math and science. I think the real issue around math and science is there's no easy solution there, and we've got to find people who will do it part-time.
Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Well, now that the question of money has come up, I want to come back to some of the best practices that you have been talking about, the idea of master teachers, the idea of apprenticeships, the idea of reunions and professional development to keep new teachers from being isolated. People have talked about class size. There are other constraints within the schools as they are currently set up. In terms of the time you arrive in the morning and the time you leave in the afternoon, the curriculum that you have to cover during the day while you're in school, then we can talk about outside rules, union rules that teachers have to conform to. What, given the budget constraints we're facing, how much would some of these changes, lengthening the school day, adding teachers to shrink class sizes, hiring master teachers who aren't in the classroom but are mentoring, how likely do you think these things are to take effect anytime soon? What would it take to really make the case and persuade taxpayers and legislators to support these changes?
Well, it's interesting to me that the number one campaign issue in every campaign for the last decade has been education. In terms of the presidential race, in terms of the governor's race, everybody is the education candidate. But as a result of that, we haven't seen much support in terms of the kinds of things you asked about in terms of education. So I think that we need to elect people and hold their feet to the fire in terms of when we talk about support for education, what do we mean? I think in terms of what we're facing now, I have a lot of apprehension about not only the possibility of bringing in, master teachers and lengthening the school day, but also just holding our own with the economy in what we're seeing as proposals in Massachusetts and federally. I'm very concerned about that.
Let me follow that up for a moment. For the last 20 years since the Reagan administration's Nation at Risk report, schools and teacher training institutions have had just wave after wave of edicts and directives and requirements and sanctions. And almost all of our states and the federal government have cut their taxes time after time. So there's less money out there and more requirements. Now, if you were to be in charge in Washington, what would be your priorities? What would be the most important things that could be done that would really help turn this situation around?
If I were in Washington and actually in charge, whatever that means, I'm not sure what that means, but let's just assume I'm really in charge. I think that the role of the federal government in education is to be the bully pulpit, is to encourage, to honor the profession, to honor education. I also think that it is the place where the role of the federal government ought to be in finding, evaluating, and disseminating best practices and supporting them. Supporting pilot projects, but we support so many pilot projects, so many reform, but how do we take that and institutionalize them? I also think the federal government would take a role in producing leaders in education. One of the huge problems today is principals and superintendents. Those are extremely difficult jobs. So ways in which to train and educate and attract people to that profession. But the federal government in Massachusetts, the state government, now regulators. That's what they do. They're regulation after regulation after regulation. I think our job as education leaders in the federal government or the state ought to be finding best practices, finding efficiencies of scale, and institutionalizing them. We know how to teach. We know how to teach kids to read. And if there weren't the reading wars, the kids in America would know how to read here. But the reading wars, ideological reading wars, are actually a political football that keeps bouncing around and changing what we can do and what we can't do. And it's happened again with this administration. So we know what to do if we could take the politics and ideology out of it, and we could make the federal government the place where it can evaluate and show what really works and find ways to institutionalize that. I think that would be a great service.
Let's take the undergraduate student who wants to become a teacher. I'm wondering how early in that person's career they get screened out of becoming a teacher. Now, maybe things have changed, but in the past, it wouldn't be until the senior year that somebody goes out for student teaching. The teacher who's going to evaluate the prospective teacher says, wow, I got a senior here. If I say anything bad, it'll ruin a whole career. I'll pass this person. The person goes into teaching. In other words, I've always felt that anybody who wants to go into teaching can, but not everybody can go into physics or economics or whatever. So how early in the careers now are students doing some practice teaching and getting into the classroom?
In most institutions, it's your junior or senior year. At Lesley, it's your first year. And even in our accelerated master's programs, if you're there for the summer, you're in a classroom. So we introduce our students to the classroom their first year, they have some exposure to a classroom for exactly the reason you're talking about, is we think this is a great thing. Until you get in the classroom, you see how hard it is. But if you do that when you're a senior, you're absolutely right. There's been a whole, I think, many generations, people got to be senior year, they walked in the classroom, they were terrible at it. But people didn't want to flunk them for their practicum because they wouldn't graduate. It's the only major they had. So I think one of the changes in education schools ought to be an insistence that people expose people to teaching early in their career and weed them out, counsel them out early. Yeah.
You indicated what your policy would be if you were educational czar. What if you were educational advisor to some presidential candidate, anyone you want, who had to get nominated and elected, and then you could execute your plan? What would your policy then be?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a ready answer. I do think some of the things I talked about tonight in terms of honoring teachers and encouraging people in the profession, and I think talking about the federal government's role is one that is a leader in helping people understand what we do better, rather than someone who is just a regulator. I think that's one of the things I would say. And then I think you'd have to, as a candidate, have to think of some specific kinds of programs that you would suggest. And some of those might be, principal boot camp training, Some of them might be developing some of these apprenticeship programs supported by the federal government as models which combine an accelerated learning with a classroom experience. I think that would be a pretty valuable thing for people to have.
Well, have you ever thought of looking for a candidate to advise?
Yes, and I have, but my candidates don't usually win. What do you think that means? I don't know.
How about financial aid for students going into education schools? How big a problem is that, and what ought we to be doing about it?
I think that one of the incentives that could encourage people to go into education is better financial aid packages. And I think there's two ways to do that. One is an inducement to people coming in, but I also think loan forgiveness works better even if somebody's already in the program in terms of retention in the profession. Loan forgiveness programs haven't always been the best inducement into a program. Good financial aid packages are. But once somebody's in school, in education, to get them to think long-term and not get queasy about taking their degree and actually going into education as opposed to doing something else, which a significant number of people do who are certified in education don't ever go into a classroom. They go do other things. And those reasons, a lot of them are economic. Some of them is because they became a senior and they decided they hated it. But I do think financial incentives, loan forgiveness, particularly for teaching in high-need schools, it can be a significant help to recruiting and retaining people.
You've described in a number of points in what you've been saying about the importance of partnership between schools, communities implied there, and education schools. I'm wondering if you could talk more about that. What is it that we talk a lot about what can education schools do to fix schools, but what are the ways in which education schools have to listen to schools, both staff and students, and to the communities from which they come?
I totally agree with you. I think that partnerships with higher education and K through 12 have not worked when they've been seen as altruistic. The higher education people, we're coming to help you. I think the only way true partnerships work are true partnerships, which is that the higher education institution gets something from the schools, and there's a lot to get. I think that what we've learned from creating true partnerships is that, it's not a university who gets a grant and then has to find a school to try something out on. I think it is working with a school or a school system, a series of schools, to find out what are the issues you're dealing with, what are those of our interest to us, what can we do together to go after some money to work together. And one of the things I've found is that having the faculties move back and forth is very important. So in the programs we've done, not only with Cambridge but with Boston and many other places, we create a team to create the program, to teach in the program, and then to disseminate the program, and on the evaluation team, which is both faculty of the schools and faculty of the university. So our literacy program, which is in all of the elementary schools in Cambridge, is managed by a team, a combined team. And our summer institutes on literacy are taught by faculty in the schools and faculty at Lesley. And we give credit to our faculty who are in the schools. So we have 4 faculty members who are half-time in schools. That's their load paid by Lesley. And we have faculty in the schools who are adjuncts and part-time honor, and we do that consciously. So again, I think, it's not like we're the good guys, we know how to do this, but I think some of the lessons we've learned about partnerships, and some of the partnerships, what happens is the higher education institution goes in, tries a pilot project, does something, there's no ownership on the part of the teachers, because it wasn't really what they wanted, it's not really what they're interested in, and then they go away and it goes away. And then, you get another piece of money and you go and try something else. Those don't work. They don't work.
Quite a few years ago, I had my 2 children in the Caribbean in what was called an infant school. And it was 2-room schoolhouse. And when my son finished the 2nd grade, he could write a good paragraph. He knew addition and subtraction and multiplication. When he came to one of the suburban schools around the Boston area, I told them that you got to watch my son to make sure he does the homework. and they only heard, "You've got to watch my son." And so when I went in 6 weeks later, they said, "I don't have to watch your kid. He's a good kid. He's not a troublemaker." And I said, "No, he's not a troublemaker." But anyway, they retaught him addition and subtraction and didn't have him do any writing. And so at the end of the third grade, he was behind where he was when he came in, having finished the second grade in the Caribbean under the British system. My wife had taught actually in the British system. At first, they didn't feel she was qualified because she didn't speak English, British English, I mean. She didn't say Mary. And so, but she had a bachelor's from Harvard in teaching and also a master's from Stanford. But at first, she rebelled at the amount of material they expected the kids to master. And then she found out that the kids just ate it up.
So what's the question?
No, my question is, what can you do? What I'm getting to is that when I was going to have him go into the fourth grade, I went to meet the teacher, and she said he does real good. And she didn't, if she didn't know the difference between good and well, and I had talked to somebody and said, well, any kid can miss one year of school, but don't let him miss two. Right. So what I found out in that school system was that they hired inexpensive teachers, and then they had no internal training program to improve the quality. If you're either going to pay more money and get good teachers who are already well trained, or you have a training program within the school so that you can bring them along. Right. And so what's going to happen now, I feel, is how do you think that they can with the budget cuts and everything, why this kind of situation won't continue?
I'm not sure it won't continue. I mean, I think one of the things the studies have shown is that while a child can survive and maybe thrive and make up for one mediocre teacher, two mediocre teachers in a row, 2 years in a row, have a very long-term effect in a difficult recovery. So while I think most teachers are great, I also am a firm believer if teachers are not good teachers, they should not be in a classroom. And we should be able to find ways to support the good teachers by, in fact, not keeping teachers who are not good, because it hurts the profession. And I think that's a difficult thing in many school systems today. People just don't want to take it on. But I think in the end it hurts the good teachers, which are the vast majority of the teachers.
We took him out of that school and put him down.
Yeah.
One thing, I know Tom, and I know he's an elitist. So I think, although he loves education, and he's an educator, he thinks that, okay, what do we do with teachers that are underpaid and no good? We take the kid and we put it, we pay money and we put the kid in a good school.
Is there a question?
My question is, isn't this what we're discussing all night, saying that we live in a diverse society that refuses to be a melting pot? Isn't what we are discussing saying that the young woman says, how am I going to teach 20 or 25 kids? I went to school in Europe with 70 kids, and the teachers were able to teach us. Why? Because there was discipline, like Tom says, and because they were inspired. Why? Because society respected the teachers. You mentioned that very well. If we think that citizens are whatever we think they are, if we don't have values, why are we even discussing education and how we are going to solve? The funds have nothing to do with anything.
Well, I think if I've said if we valued education like we say we do, we treat teachers and education funding, and would talk about it differently, they would fund it differently, I think there's no way to turn back time. There's no way to go back to the days my parents were teachers, and it was a different time. In fact, there was some problems being the daughter of the principal of the junior high school, my dad, because there were no boys who would come to my house to take me out. So there was a downside to being totally respected in the community. But we can't go back. We have to go forward. It's a different society. It's a different need. But which is why we have to adjust and keep the values the same, which is for sure, which is we got to value teaching and teachers.
A different question, which
we want to have time for one more question.
With your partnerships and your funds and your grants, are you going forward or backward?
Well, we're going forward.
I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
I hope so.
Now we have the last question.
You've clearly committed to raising the quality of professional, quote-unquote, teachers, but what is your thinking about the fact that 80% of kids' time is spent outside of school, and what happens in after-school programs and tutoring, and how we raise the quality there? Almost if nobody really wants to have people who aren't brain surgeons do brain surgery, are there still some gains to be made from a sort of a public health approach in terms of teaching all the other teachers how to teach?
Sure. I totally agree. I think, we have bifurcated, trifurcated, whatever we want to call it, education after-school programs. And if education policy started with the child and came up, rather than the agencies down, we'd be much better off. I mean, I remember, the problems with, taking a child on a bus from their school to an after-school program. You couldn't do that because it's not allowed. I mean, the regulations are all in the way. So if everybody would just keep saying, what's the goal here? What are we trying to do? What is the goal here? And if the goal is always the child, what is the best interest of the child? The best interest of the child I've met absolutely by a holistic view of that child's life, which is public health, which is after school, which is enrichment program, which is parental involvement, parental training, parental support. I mean, that's holistic. And how do you build that for that school in that system, rather than here are the 22 agencies, and I'll take this piece, you take this piece, and they don't even talk to each other. I mean, we've got to think differently. There's no question about it. And that's why political leadership can make a difference. It can. I mean, I think colleges and universities ought to be judged by the percentage of their alums who vote after they've graduated 10 years. I want to be judged that way, and I want other colleges and universities. If your graduates don't vote, I mean, I'd like to be able to tell them how to vote, but at least if they vote, then we're not doing our job, because these folks affect our lives. And we have got to get people in positions of power and influence who care about that child from the child up, not the ideology down. And we can make a difference. I'm a product of the 60s. I really do believe this. We can put people in positions of power and influence who will turn this around. But we've got to believe it will happen, and we've got to get people to the polls, and we've got to get people speaking out that other people will listen to.
Thank you, Margaret McKenna. You've